remember clearly sitting in the office and the careers advisor, having heard what I had to say, said to me, have you ever thought about radio journalism? And when he said that, it really, I thought, yes, that's exactly what I'd like to do. I'd love to do football commentary.
It's a shame I can't remember it, but like the first game I reported on, but I can't. I'm not one of those who remembers every co-commentator they've worked with or every match or every ground they've been to. I'd love to check off a list of every ground I've been to, but I've been to most of them probably in the Football League, but can't remember.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of The Lineup, brought to you by Sheepskins for Goalposts. This live stream podcast covers all aspects of TV, radio and audio football commentary. It's a podcast by commentators for commentators. So let us know who you are and where you are in the world by writing in the comments section. My name is Mike Saul. I'm your host. I've been a professional football commentator and reporter for just over 30 years. Our guest commentators on episode 2 hail from different parts of the UK and have differing backgrounds in football commentary. A bit later, we'll be joined by Chris Goreham, who, like many of his BBC local radio colleagues, has vast experience of covering one professional club. In Chris's case, he's BBC Radio Norfolk's Norwich City football commentator and has been for about 20 years, and he's fresh from the Canaries' derby win over East Anglian rivals Ipswich. We'll ask him how he keeps his composure when commentating on his hometown club in such an important game. First, though, a commentator who's worked in local commercial and BBC radio, but is now primarily a network TV commentator. You can find him covering the main game on ITV's coverage of the EFL, the highlight show. He provides commentary for FIFA tournaments around the world, as well as English-speaking commentaries of UEFA Nations League and European qualifiers. He's neither fast nor furious, but I reckon he's better known in his native South Yorkshire than his more famous namesake. Paul Walker joins us on the lineup this evening. Hello, Paul. How are you?
Mike. Thanks for the intro. I must apologise for the grainy picture. I can assure you we can afford electric here in North Derbyshire. It's just the lighting in my lounge is more sultry, shall we say, than the bright lights of your spare room.
Subtle, a bit like your commentary.
Yeah. Okay. You said it, not me.
First things first, what was your last game? What was the last game you commentated on?
That's a really good question. Where was I?
Feeling. Everybody has that.
Yeah, I was at Cardiff against Hull on Saturday. Wow. You foxed me with the first one. Cardiff against Hull.
That is a difficult question, isn't it? Because I find that someone says, a family member or somebody says, oh, what did you get up to last week? Where did you go? What games did you go to? I literally have to look in my diary. Unless the game stood out, like yesterday I did Feyenoord Ajax. But unless it stands out, those games, it's probably like a normal day at work. It passes you by because you... And I don't know, was it Rob Daly said this or John Murray said this on the last episode, that when you prepare for these games, you've done it, move on to the next one.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the worst time to try and have a conversation with me is directly after a game. Doing the job as I do now, we have floor managers whose jobs it is to kind of get word on the substitutions, make sure the managers get to the interview rooms. And quite often I will come down from the gantry and the floor manager will say, oh, what about this that happened? What about that happened? And I'm kind of, I physically cannot remember that moment in the game because you're so stitched in and the concentration levels are so high. Afterwards, your brain is just frazzled. And it takes a good hour for me to kind of come round and then remember what's just happened in the game, which might sound weird, but it's true. I'd be interested to know whether other commentators are the same, whether they're so absorbed by what they've just watched for an hour and a half, whether they can actually physically remember everything that's just happened in the game. I know I certainly can't.
There are two types of television commentary. We'll get on to what's called off-tube. shortly. But you, when you do your EFL highlights, you get sent to Cardiff in this case. You're working on site. Tell us a little bit about your day and when it starts. Let's say for Cardiff. I mean, you live up in, as you say, North Derbyshire. That's a fair trek.
Yeah, I left home at 7:45 on Saturday morning and got back at 10 o'clock at night. I did it there and back. There are trips where I'll look to stay over, but that's really only Plymouth and Swansea. I tend to go there and back. I'm not good in hotels anyway. So yeah, long drive, 3.5 hours or more with a stop for a coffee. Get to the stadium. I aim to get there for about 12. So you can go meet the director and the production crew and the camera guys and go and check out the TV position. That being said, I've been to these grounds so many times now. I know exactly where they are, but I like to get in there, speak to the local radio guys, pick their brains on what changes might be made by both managers to the team lineups, and just get a flavour as to how they've been going over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Because what you have to remember is, because I'm not covering one team all of the time, it's difficult to stay on track of what every club is up to. You do your best, of course, but quite often the local radio guys, the local newspaper fellas, women, can often help you out and give you a good steer as to how the managers are thinking, what the fans are thinking, and just to help with that little bit of background. You know, their information is priceless, really. And then you kind of sit in the press room. If you're lucky, you might get a bite to eat. And then you finish off your little bit of prep. And then at 1:45, I head down to the tunnel area, and that's when we wait for the team sheets to be swapped by the two managers, the captains. They meet the referee, and we are there when that happens. So we get the very first copy of the team sheet, as it were, before it's printed out, and then we can go off and start working out formations, who's going to play where, etc. Because then, when we know the formations, that information is sent by the floor manager to the TV gallery, which is based in London, and they then can put the graphics out. So as a viewer, when you're watching any game and you see the team lineups come up on screen in formation, that is the information that we are sending. They then just have to build the graphics ready for when we get to the team news part, which is roughly 2 minutes, 3 minutes before kickoff.
And so this is all pre-match at the ground. You've already done, I don't know, a day's worth of prep, maybe more, before you even left home. Mm-hmm. Would you say, I'm not saying the commentary is easy, but I don't know about you, but once I get in the commentary, I relax.
Yeah, that for me is the easier part. Because in the build-up, you're kind of hitting timings. And for the world feed coverage that I do on a Saturday, believe it or not, we go on air about 5 minutes before kickoff. So you set the game up, then you talk around the league table, and on site, I do not see that league table. I'm doing that not to graphics. So I'm kind of
You're doing it blind, as we say.
Doing it blind, basically, yeah. And same goes for the team news as well. So, you know, you only get a certain amount of time to get the league table away, the team boards away before the game actually starts. So in terms of the most stressful part of the afternoon, I would say that is it. That hour 2 till 3 is the most stressful part of my afternoon, working out the formations, making sure that the guys in London have got everything they need. The director knows roughly where I'm going to go ahead of kickoff. And as you say, when the game starts, then you're into the flow, aren't you?
And post-match, you've got to get back down the tunnel. You've got to interview sometimes feisty managers and maybe a player if you're lucky.
Yeah, sometimes they can be feisty. I've had to ask certain managers along the way whether they fear for their jobs, because
it's always a favourite question. It's always a favourite question of mine.
Yeah, I've not had to do it for a while. In truth, I think the last manager I had to ask it of was, funnily enough, Alex Neil when he was at Norwich, maybe when he was going through a tough time. But I don't take any pleasure in asking those kind of questions. But at the same time, there is a responsibility on me as a commentator / reporter to sometimes ask those kind of questions, and you know roughly what you're going to get back. But for me, in those instances, it's more important to be seen to be asking the questions sometimes rather than getting the answer that you might get, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because some supporters might be watching it saying, well, this fella's lost 11 of his last 12 matches, yet the reporter never even asked him whether he felt he was in trouble, under pressure, etc. So sometimes you've got to ask those questions. You put your reputation on the line, and hopefully relationships as a result aren't damaged as a consequence. But sometimes you've got to stick your head above the parapet and do that kind of thing.
And once those interviews are done, that's the day done, and then you've got to get home. So as you say, it's a 14-hour day for where you went on Saturday. Your career now is very much pretty solely TV, isn't it? But you started out in commercial radio locally up in, you're from Sheffield originally. Let's have a bit of a look at the snapshot of your career. Hallam FM. You were telling me about this when we were prepping for this show, that you had a very interesting baptism almost in terms of football reporting, because unlike most of us who gradually work through local football and that kind of, you were literally thrust in.
I was, yeah. Just to go back a couple of steps before that to give you a bit of a flavour as to how I got into radio in the first place. I did GCSEs at school, did okay, stayed on, did A-levels. The only reason really I stayed on to do A-levels is because I wasn't particularly sure on what I wanted to do. I think I had an inkling that radio was the route I wanted to go down. And somebody once told me, the best thing to do is to try and get experience. So I knocked on a lot of doors, made a lot of phone calls. Excuse the dog in the background if that's bleeding through. And eventually the sports editor at Hallam FM relented and said, look, come in on a Saturday, see what we do. I went in, loved it. I was in total awe of the whole operation. And I literally started making teas, coffees. I literally did make tea and coffee for the first 3-4 months. And then I was promoted to taking the scores down off teletext back then and then running them through to the studio. And as time went on, I was given more responsibility. I was a big part of the production team, working on editing goals on reel-to-reel tapes with razor blades and all that kind of thing.
Well, people of our age started out that way, yeah. So that was quite a test. I had quite a demanding boss, Steve Banyard at the time, who was brilliant. And then one particular afternoon, I used to read the breakfast sport bulletins, and my shift started 5:30 in the morning, finished about 2:30 in the afternoon. Then one particular day, I was asked to stay on, and Steve sadly was sacked that day. There's no other way of putting it, really. And I was told, right, you're in charge now, you're sports editor, and you are doing the commentary tomorrow night. Now, this tomorrow night was Arsenal against Sheffield United in February 1999. Now, you might recall the day that Steve Bruce, who was Sheffield United manager at the time, took the players off the pitch at Highbury on a Saturday afternoon in an FA Cup tie. The ball had gone out of play. Sheffield United had a player down injured. And instead of giving the ball back, Arsenal played on. I think it was Carnu who scored. And obviously the Sheffield United players were up in arms saying, look, we put the ball out so that our player could receive treatment, and you should have given us the ball back when play resumed. Now, Arsene Wenger very sportingly said, look, our mistake, we'll replay the game, which took place a few days later. So that was your first game.
That was my first game.
The replay game.
Yeah, the replay game. And I had never done a match report on the radio.
You hadn't even done a match report? You'd not been to a local game ever?
No, nothing.
I'd been on the radio. Wow.
I'd purely been an employee behind the scenes up until this point. So the only football ground I think I'd been to, or maybe two, was Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United, Bramall Lane and Hillsborough, as a supporter. So this was my first ever trip to a stadium outside of Sheffield. And I was asked to do commentary on Arsenal against Sheffield United. Thankfully, I don't have a recording of it anywhere because I'm pretty sure it was god-awful. But that was sink or swim time. But it was a great patch because Sheffield Wednesday back then were in the Premier League. So on alternate weeks, I used to do Sheffield United and Sheffield Wednesday. one in what is now the Championship, one in the Premier League, and then occasionally do Barnsley, Rotherham, Chesterfield, or Doncaster. But yeah, that was a real baptism of fire, and I knew after that night I had a heck of a long way to go to get anywhere near listenable.
You weren't emotionally scarred by it, because some people would have sunk, wouldn't they?
Yeah, probably. And you know what? If social media had been prominent back then, it might have finished me for good. Thankfully, Twitter and all that kind of thing wasn't really a thing back then. But I think the whole experience just gave me a taste of it and what it's all about, being in the thick of it, feeling the buzz of the crowd, and just getting a real adrenaline rush. I just wanted more.
So that was Hallam FM. You then moved to BBC Radio Sheffield 5 years later, which, as you say, was a really good patch. And I know you have a very good listenership for BBC Radio Sheffield's football coverage, because you have two huge clubs in Sheffield plus the other four in the area. What was it like covering those clubs? I guess you covered, like you say, you covered the Blades and you covered the Owls most weeks. You alternated.
Yeah, we did. But the patch itself, brilliant, because, you know, during that period we had Barnsley in the Premier League as well, just prior to 99, before I did my first commentary game. We had Chesterfield in an FA Cup semi-final against Middlesbrough in 97. I did go to that as a reporter. Oh, no, I didn't go as a reporter. Steve Banyard did take me as a treat to Old Trafford in 97. So what I said previously about never being to a ground outside of Sheffield, technically a lie. I had gone to Old Trafford to watch Chesterfield against Middlesbrough, the 3-3, which was just phenomenal. What a game, and is still...
Sean Dyche scored in that game, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, Chesterfield should have won that day. They had a goal disallowed that should never, ever have been disallowed. Chesterfield should have been in the FA Cup final. The replay at Hillsborough was more of a damp squib. But yeah, the game at Old Trafford, John Duncan, God bless him, no longer with us, was a great guy to deal with. And I was very lucky. The managers in the main on this patch were always great, apart from a run-in I had with David Pleat once, which, you know, I can share if you wish.
Well, so we like an anecdote.
Yeah, so I was only young, and I'd gone to interview David Pleat. I think the week before they'd been thrashed at Man United, and it was an innocuous question, really. All I said was, you know, heavy defeat last weekend, David. Can you understand why the fans are getting frustrated? And he kind of snapped and said, if I was a violent man, I'd punch you in the face, but I'm not, so I won't.
He said that on mic.
He said that on tape, which rocked me a little bit. And then every other reply from him was really short. So I was kind of sent out of Hillsborough with my tail between my legs. And it transpired that later on he apologised, but rang the wrong radio station. He rang BBC Radio Sheffield as opposed to Hallam FM. He apologised to the sports editor at Radio Sheffield, David Burns, and he said, I think you've got the wrong radio station, David. I didn't hear anything after that until I bumped into David a few years later. It was a few years later at Old Trafford, who then made a point of coming over and apologising. So, you know, I think that's testament to the man, really, that A, he'd not forgotten, and B, he made a real point of coming over and apologising. But yeah, what a fantastic patch. Very, very lucky. Seen some great games, covered the Sheffield derbies, covered countless playoff games, playoff finals, FA Cup nights at Bramall Lane in particular, when Neil Warnock was there. Managed to forge a great relationship with every manager I've worked alongside. And the fan base up here are just so passionate. The banter is fantastic. We launched a nightly football show, Football Heaven, back in the day, still going strong now, where fans can ring up every night with their views.
Every night?
Every night, Monday to Friday. I introduced that. It's still going now. And of course, it's home to Praise or Grumble, which is the original football phone-in, which was launched by, I hope I get this right, I think it was Bob Jackson who launched it, who's still out there somewhere. Hello, Bob, if you're listening, watching. And a lot of these phone-ins you hear now were all kind of spin-offs of Praise or Grumble. We were the home of football, the home of the first football phone in Sheffield. So we come from good stock up here, you know, Mike.
Steely stock.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I want to hear, I know you've got some great Neil Warnock anecdotes, and there's one I really like, which you told me before on our trips together. But let's bring in our other guest commentator for this episode. He has a very defined and dedicated commentary role with BBC Radio Norfolk, covering one club, Norwich City. He's been doing it for almost 20 years. Unlike Paul, when he was at Hallam and at Radio Sheffield, catering for those several clubs, Chris's sole focus is this one and only professional club in the county, not just the city, in the county. And after Norwich's 10th derby win over Ipswich a couple of days ago, I suspect he's in pretty good spirits. Chris Goreham, have you come down from the high of winning the derby on Saturday?
Mike, had the result have gone the other way, would you have had that shirt behind you?
Yes. Yes, I would have done. This is especially for you. Especially,
I thought it might be. I picked up on that. Hi, Mike. Hi, Paul. I've got to say, I've been listening to the podcast so far, and it's been like being in a therapy session for me. It's been so cathartic listening. I now know I'm not the only person that feels so frazzled after a commentary. I can't remember what's happened. You get faced with a football manager or a player after a game, and you think, well, what am I going to ask him? Because I can't remember in detail what's happened. It's so good hearing that I'm not the only person that goes through all of those emotions in the final hour after a football commentary on a Saturday afternoon.
Well, I've stood next to you this season as well at Norwich, and I remember back in, would have been November, after Norwich were beaten at home by Blackburn, you had to ask the question that Paul mentioned earlier about, is your job on the line? I think you phrased it as being, are you the man that can turn things around? I think that was the way you put it to David Wagner. And I have to say, David Wagner handled it very well. Some managers may not have liked a question like that, but it is tough, isn't it, when you've got to ask a question like that in front of, in sometimes a very intimidating character. Not in David's case, but
no, that's it. And I think that's the key to it. You get to know managers, and you get to know how much tact you've got to employ with the way you ask the questions. But I think most football managers now realise that doing not just local radio interviews, national radio interviews, national TV, they do so much media now. I think there is much more of an understanding that this is part of the job, and that if you're a championship head coach who at that point I think had only won 1 in 10 matches, you know, these questions are going to come up. There's no way they're not. And I think most managers, most head coaches do understand that. I've always found that, and you don't really want to get locked into an argument with a football manager when emotions are raw after a game. So I've always found it quite useful to just subtly put in a question about, you know, your fans are listening to this in the car on the way home, just to remind them that they're not talking to you, actually.
Play devil's advocate almost.
Or just to place in their mind that what you're asking is not necessarily because you want them to lose their job or because you think they're doing a bad job. You're asking on behalf of all those people who effectively
rely on you,
pay the wages. Yeah, and you're not. You want the manager to realise they're not just addressing that answer to you personally. It's to the hopefully thousands of people that have stayed with you on the radio to hear what the manager has to say. So I think that there's always that bit of empathy as well, because in most cases, football managers are just people doing their best, aren't they? They're not. There's no scandal involved. That they've made the selection decisions, they've picked the tactics because they genuinely believed it was the best thing to do. So I think as long as you approach it with that bit of empathy, that bit of tact, and just remind the managers gently why they're there, who they're speaking to, I think most of them understand that if results are poor, they're going to get questions like this. And if they do respond as David Pleat did to Paul all those years ago, then actually they probably are the ones that come out of the situation not so much looking worse, but what they say says a lot about the amount of pressure they're under and how they're feeling. So sometimes if you do get a bit of a snappy reply, it says more about them and the position they're in than it does the interview. And I think you have to remember that and try to let that help you develop a thick skin, I think.
It's interesting that both of you started out, well, Chris, you're still in covering local radio football. You're a team, a specific team. The difference between you and Paul is that, Paul, you had to have that balance because you got 2 big teams in one city, whereas Chris has just got the one team. There's a big difference there, isn't there? You have to be careful to upset one side of the city.
Yeah, well, I succeeded on both counts, really, upsetting both sides of the Steel City in various situations. But, you know, the big one was the Sheffield derby, of course. and trying to stay down the middle on that one. I think I can safely get away with saying now that I am a Sheffield United fan. For years, I tried to hide that, but now I'm freelance and no longer have a connection, shall we say, to BBC Radio Sheffield. I can probably say that. But, you know, those derby games were tricky. I suppose deep down you wanted the red and white half of the city to win. But I think when you're doing a game like that, professionalism takes over. And genuinely, the only thing on my mind in those games was to deliver it as balanced as I possibly could, give the listener the best possible experience we could. And I think the good barometer for me in the aftermath of those games was getting fans from both sides accusing me of being an owl or a blade. So you'd have Owls fans saying, "He's a blade him," or "He's an owl him." Now that for me was a good measure of how we managed to do it. And as daft as it sounds, it's just another game. That might come and bite me, but it is just another game. You are there to commentate on a game of football. Yes, the occasion's bigger, the magnitude of it feels bigger, but you're there just to describe the action and what's going on and do it to the best of your ability. And I hope I managed to achieve that in those big Sheffield Derby games, of which there were many.
2 days ago, Chris, you were in that position, the big derby, a very tense game. You've got one team top of the table, another team, in your case, the team you're following, trying to stay in the playoffs. And you're from Norwich. You're a Norwich fan, grew up with the club. How do you find it? Clearly, you can adopt a bias in a way, can't you? Because you are working for the county itself. But you're not working for the club. So there's got to be that defined line between, and I call it a we, us and them. You can't refer to Norwich City as we, us and them, even though that's the team you're covering. That's the team that you want to do well, not just within your heart, but for your professional level. But you have to keep a slight distance, especially, as we mentioned earlier, when you've got to come to ask the tough questions.
Yeah, and I think that's why, although it's a very different situation to Paul found himself in commentating on the Sheffield Derby, I would use the same word to describe how you do it, and that is balance. It's appreciating that you are there not to just wear a yellow and green shirt like the one you've got behind you and wave your scarf and cheer everything that Norwich do. You're not. You're there. I always liken it to if you're watching the World Cup in the summer and you're watching Australia against France, and John Watson back in the day, or Barry Davies back in the day, was commentating on that one, they would commentate on that game very differently to the way they would commentate on England against Croatia, because they know that their audience, the majority of their audience, want England to win. And it's the same for us. We know when we're on Saturday afternoon, it's the East Anglian Derby, we're BBC Radio Norfolk, most of our listeners want Norwich to win. So there's a way of telling the story from a Norwich point of view. And when Marcelino Nunez put that free kick in on Saturday, Norwich were in the lead, whereas if you're listening to BBC Radio Suffolk, Ipswich were behind. You tell the story from that point of view. But absolutely, it doesn't mean that you cheer everything they do. You don't become a cheerleader. I hope I've never used we or us during a commentary. I definitely try not to. People will probably be able to find examples where it slipped out, but I really hope I haven't, because again, the balance is different. Whereas Paul would like to get criticism from both owls and blades of bias, for us, we get criticism of, oh, we're too in favour of the club, or, oh, you're too negative, you're too against the club. We get on a Saturday afternoon or during the season probably just about equal amounts of both, and that's the balance that we are trying to achieve. If you're getting equal amounts of you're too negative or you're too positive about the one club that you're covering, then that's probably the balance that you're looking for.
Now, you weren't thrust into football reporting like Paul was. You were able to cover local football before you commentated on Norwich, but your first commentary, within 5 minutes, you were hit with a very rare occurrence, and it wasn't anything to do with the football.
No, it wasn't. And my football commentary career is now over 20 years. And the thing that happened in the first game I did has never happened again since. I wanted to be a football commentator from quite an early age. And I got the chance to do it after working my way up the same route as Paul, actually, making the tea behind the scenes at BBC Radio Norfolk, making use of yourself, being keen enough. You know, in the end, they ask you to fill in on shifts when people are on holiday or phone in sick. And eventually that they trust you enough to give you a chance to have a go at commentary. And I was allowed to share the mic with the great Roy Waller, who I know you know, Mike, and Paul will remember as well, who was the Norwich City commentator for decades before I was lucky enough to take over the microphone. Sadly, Roy's no longer with us, but he was the big character locally. He was a massive name in Norfolk, and he did all the Norwich City commentaries. And they realised that there was the odd game in a season that he wasn't going to be able to do, and they needed somebody who could pick up the odd game when he was away. And somebody at Radio Norfolk luckily thought that I might be able to do it. So for a pre-season friendly against the Dutch team here in Wien, they let me sit alongside Roy, and we were going to do it the way they used to do it on 5 Live, where Roy would do the first half of the first half, and then I would pick up and have a go up until half time. And Roy did his 22 and a half minutes of this sort of tame pre-season friendly, typical stuff really against here in Wien. And then I picked up a sunny July afternoon at Carrow Road. 5 minutes into my first commentary stint, the sky went black. A huge electrical storm broke out, thunder and lightning. And with it being a pre-season friendly, there was no need to keep the players out in that. So the referee took the players off the pitch, only temporarily. But 5 minutes into my first football commentary, there was no football. Now, it was suddenly I found myself on Test Match Special trying to fill a rain break. And I looked to my right-hand side, and Roy sat there, who's been doing this, the commentary for years and years. And I had to look in my eyes as if to say, help me. And I've never seen a person enjoying broadcasting quite so much. He just sat back, his arms folded, and he was like, all right, you wanted to do this? Go on then. And I think it was about 10 or 15 minutes before the players came back out, and we just had to keep it going. And I think it was a good early lesson. It felt horrible at the time, but having got through it, I think it was an early lesson that no matter how much prep you do, no matter how much you know about stats and how much you know about the players, the trick really is to be in the moment. And there will often be something that you will not have thought of, that you will not have prepared for, and you've got to be ready for it. And as I say, I've had a bit of floodlight failure since, or long delays for injuries, but I've never had all the players going off the field like a cricket match for heavy rain before. And it happened 5 minutes into my first ever game.
And of course, you have serious incidents as well. And I mean, Paul will know about this, being from Sheffield with the Hillsborough tragedy. Those type of things, unfortunately, do happen now and then. And people like commentators are in those positions where they have to, I don't know, they have to put their news hat on. They have to be empathetic. They have to be there's a lot of things going on in a situation like, clearly Hillsborough happened before you started out, Paul, but you will have spoken to people and know people that worked that day. Yeah, I mean, not to those levels, thankfully. Have I had to deal with anything like that? But a couple of years ago, I was at Fulham doing a cup tie there, and somebody fell really badly ill in the stand at Fulham, and the game had to be stopped for a good 15 minutes there. I didn't have to fill for 15 minutes. I was able to hand back to the studio, and thankfully they took care of matters from there. But that was unnerving, because nobody really knew what was going on, and thankfully the gent involved was okay. He got whisked away to hospital, and news came through later on that he was fine and made a full recovery. But you're right, you just never know what to expect when you're at a game, and you have to be on your guard all the time. Thankfully, incidents like Hillsborough, tragedies like that are few and far between now. But it just goes to show you've got to be ready for anything in this game. Pre-match stresses are also fairly common, and my biggest stress was always getting to the game on time and finding a car park space. Now, when you've done it for a few years, like you said earlier, Paul, you do know that you'll get a space at, I don't know, Derby, or you'll get a space at Norwich. You'll be fine. But there are some grounds where you can't get a space, and there are some journeys that are very unpredictable. And Chris, tell us about your trip to Hull a few years ago, and what you had to deal with before you even got to the ground.
Well, again, I agree with something that Paul said earlier about once the game kicks off and you're able to commentate, you do almost relax into it, because there's so much that can go wrong before that. And particularly if you're covering a team like Norwich City, where everywhere is miles and miles away, we end up leaving very early in the morning to get to these away games, because you've got to build in not just the technical problems that might occur with your broadcast equipment when you get to the ground, but any hold-ups on the roads, any traffic jams, anything unpredictable like that. And we had a memorable trip to Hull. I think it was in Daniel Farke's first season, so it's about that five or 6 years ago. And myself and Rob Butler, who presents our coverage and our phone in, I was traveling with him. We got as far as the Humber Bridge, which is from our side, the way into Hull. And while we were on the bridge, somebody further up the bridge had a car crash, and it wasn't a serious one. Everyone was okay, but it was enough for all the traffic to stop on the bridge. And once you're on the bridge with a central reservation, there's no way off it. You can't U-turn and get back off it again and find another way around. So we sat there, and you've got that horrible feeling where you're looking at the clock in the car ticking closer and closer to 2 o'clock, the time that we're on the air, and you're looking on your phones at how far away the ground is. And in the end, we decided that I was going to get out of the car, Rob was going to stay with the car, I was going to take all of our broadcast equipment, and I was going to walk across the Humber Bridge and try and get past the accident and get a taxi the other end. And that's what I thought
you were about to say you were about to jump in the Humber
no,
and swim it.
I did, because there's nothing. It's one of my worst fears is that the game kicks off, everyone's tuning in at 3 o'clock, and they know that their mates who've gone to the game have got there, they've made it from Norfolk, and you as a commentator, the guy who's being paid to be there, haven't managed to get there. That is one of my worst fears. I've run it close a couple of times. That was one of them. And those are the sort of stresses. That is the sort of thing that will keep me awake at night and worry in the build up to a game, probably more than anything during the game. And I think certainly if we've got people watching this and listening to this who are keen to get into commentary, actually they'll think it's all about doing your prep and getting your commentary notes right. And absolutely it is, but there's a whole nother role of admin and rigmarole that you have to do in the build up to a game, and you have to think about, because no matter how good your commentary notes are, if you're stuck in traffic, if you've taken a wrong turn, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't get to the game, it's no good at all, is it?
Well, Paul, only 2 weeks ago, you were hit with a very unusual situation for what is an off-tube commentary. Now, if anyone doesn't know what off-tube is, basically that's not when you're on site. That's when you're in a studio and you have television feeds and there's a gallery opposite you and you are commentating to pictures rather than being present at the game. That's what's referred to as off-tube. Now, you were doing one of the friendly games, Spain-Colombia. And tell us what happened to you pre-kickoff. And now, obviously, it's a busy, that hour and 15 minutes before kickoff, it gets very busy because you've got to work out the teams. What happened to you?
We are lucky, though. We do have a commentator information system that will put the lineups up roughly an hour and 15 minutes ahead of kickoff. Now, that's a movable feast. It can be an hour and 15. It can be an hour. On this occasion, it was bang on time, and it's very good. It puts it all in formation order for you. Now, my commentary notes I put onto sticky labels, which I then put on like a laminated A4 sheet of paper, because that then allows me to move my stickers around. So I got to grips with who was playing where. Spain, I've done an awful lot of in the last 4 or 5 years, so I kind of know how they're going to play. Colombia, less so. So I've got everything lined up. I'd written all my team news. James Rodriguez was in the team. I thought I'll write a bit about him because he's a recognizable figure. I think he was making his 98th cap or something like that. So he was just 2 away from a century of caps. So I've got everything written out. I've got information on these debutants that were going to be starting, ready to go. So then you sat looking at the screen, just waiting for your producer to give you the green light, and it's time to start commentating. Now, roughly 3-4 minutes before we're due to go on air, I happened to look at the screen, looked at the team sheet that I'd been provided with by a runner who'd brought it up from downstairs. The one on the screen and the one on the paper and the one crucially on my notes had suddenly changed pretty much completely by about 6 or 7 players. And they're all playing in different positions now. And I was slightly suspicious when it was first announced because I knew that Colombia do play with a back 4. But the formation had them down as playing a back 3. And I just thought, well, maybe because it's a friendly, the Copa America's coming up, maybe he's just trying to experiment a little bit. Suddenly, I'm in a position where I haven't got a clue who's playing and where. And in the stress and the panic, the producer said, we're going on air in 2 minutes. I'm trying to frantically rewrite all of the team news. I missed my cue to go live on air. Thankfully, we go on air 4 or 5 minutes before, so it was just crowd noise, okay? So it wasn't as if I missed the start of the game, but even still, you felt a bit of a wally, to be honest. but I would rather have 60 seconds of just general crowd noise than me go on air and put out the complete wrong team for Colombia. And as of now, I still do not know what happened. It was being played at the London Stadium. And ironically, I was in a studio in London, not a million miles away from the ground, yet nobody seems to know what happened. Clearly, a team sheet has gone in. That's been whisked off to a printer somewhere and been published. In between times, Colombia must have changed and resubmitted another one along the way. I don't know, but that was incredibly stressful because your brain, when you first get the formation, it then becomes programmed. So number 14 is playing left back, number 2 is playing right back, 5 and 6 in the middle, 24 and 18 in the middle of the park. My brain computes where those numbers, where those players are going to be. When somebody whisks that away suddenly, your brain's kind of going, can't compute. James Rodriguez didn't start the game. He started on the bench, came on later on. And the players who I thought were playing, the debutants, suddenly weren't. They were on the bench. So for the first 5 or 10 minutes, it was kind of legs going 10 to the dozen under the water whilst trying to be calm on the surface. And I dare say there are commentators out there watching this that have had similar issues before, but I've never had it that late. I've had maybe an alteration because of an injury in a warm-up. You still got time to readjust, but not that late. I really do not know what happened there, but it was very, very uncomfortable.
And that's one of the problems with doing off-tube commentary. You don't have that 3D view of what's going on. You're literally relying on the pictures that you get. And in actual fact, we've got a question from Sean Elderbrandt, who's covers Falkirk up in Scotland. When covering games off tube, Paul, do you find it difficult to find your excitement levels for goal shouts, big moments, when you aren't amongst the atmosphere like you would be on site?
Good question. And the answer is no, because we get a feed of the effects. So what I do, I turn the effects really loud in my headphones, as loud as it will go, to try and make it feel as though I am actually in the stadium. I hate it when you can't hear crowd effects in your ears. I like something to be able to compete with, to fight against almost. So I always have it really loud, perhaps too loud sometimes, to the point where the producer who might want to get a message to me, I can't hear him because the crowd effects are so loud in my headphones. But I have to have it like that. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like, I mean, I'm not in the stadium anyway, but I like to feel as though I'm still part of the occasion. So good question. But yeah, I always turn my crowd effects levels up to the max in my headphones to make it feel like I'm there.
Chris, because of what you do, you are on site, well, 100% of the time normally, but during COVID, you had to do your first off-tube commentaries. How did you find that, having, for 15, 16 years, done everything on site? How did you find doing it off-tube?
I found it really difficult because there was a spell in COVID where the BBC decided that it didn't want its local radio reporters travelling around the country. And when you remember what life was like at the time, you probably look back and you can understand why they made that decision. But it was an uncomfortable 3 or 4 months, because unlike the off-tube commentaries that Paul will have done, most of them, where he will go to a site that is specifically designed for doing off-tube commentaries, we had to turn one of the meeting rooms at work into a place where you could somehow get a feed of the game that Norwich were playing away from home. The odd game was live on Sky, and you would just literally use the Sky pictures. But otherwise, you were like the supporters who, if you remember during COVID, were relying on the Football League feeds that each club gets on their website. And sometimes that's just a one-camera operation. So you just get whatever that camera person is looking at the time. You don't get the nuances. You don't know when a sub is warming up. And there was one game where Norwich were under a bit of pressure late on. They were defending a corner, and before the corner was taken, we were shown a replay of one of the previous incidents. Norwich cleared the corner and broke away, and suddenly Adam Eder, the Norwich striker, the very young Norwich striker at the time, had the ball, and I hadn't seen him come on. We'd not been given the information that he'd come on as a substitute, and suddenly there he was, bearing down on goal, and you're describing a play that you haven't told your listeners is on the pitch. So I found it so much more difficult, so much fraught with all sorts of worries and things that you were so concerned you'd miss something all the time. And we didn't have a feed of the crowd noise either. So sometimes you'd see the ball go into the back of the net, and I suppose there wouldn't have been crowd noise because it was COVID, but you know what I mean? We didn't have the effects of the referee's whistle. You didn't know quite whether a player had been flagged offside, whether a goal was going to stand in the way that you should immediately do if you're inside the stadium. So I found that experience really, really uncomfortable. And when we were allowed to start travelling again, as nice as it was to effectively be home from Cardiff an hour after the game finished, actually I didn't mind the long journeys for the experience. I find it so much easier being in the ground.
Paul, tell us, because you've done radio and TV, tell us the differences between commentating on radio and television. Some people might think, well, it's pretty much the same, but that is not the case, is it?
No, I would say they are two very different skill sets. Obviously, radio, you have a license to be more descriptive. You have to paint pictures. You have to give an idea where the ball is all of the time. TV, for example, you have to be more selective with the language that you use, because at the end of the day, the fan, the viewer can see what you can see. There's no need to say player X makes a run down the right-hand side. Now, that still slips out from time to time, and you will still hear that on the TV. But most, if not all, TV commentators would try and veer away from stating the bleeding obvious. Sometimes it's unavoidable. And also, what I've really struggled with is not having to talk all of the time. That's been the biggest challenge of all doing TV commentary. You do not have to talk all of the time. So if a team has the ball in the back four, there's no pressure on them, and they're just kind of passing side to side and playing amongst themselves, there's no need to say anything there unless you've got something interesting to say. And leaving those pauses just feels really unnatural sometimes. I always think, I need to fill this with something. And then another voice in my head said, no, you don't. Let the game breathe. And I still occasionally hear commentators doing a TV game as if it was a radio game. I try not to do it that way. I don't think I've perfected it yet. Probably will never perfect it. But I think sometimes it's nice just to ease off and let the viewer take the game in for themselves. And then when you sense something is starting to get interesting / exciting, that's when you kind of go again, as it were.
Have you done any TV commentary, Chris? I know your commentary gets used for highlights packages, but have you ever actually done any TV commentary?
Not specifically for TV. As you say, quite often the radio commentary we've done gets put to the pictures, and I think then you can see how different it is, because you are watching pictures, and yes, I am pointing at the bleeding obvious, because what I'm doing is commentating for a radio audience that's then been laid over the pictures. So I think if you watch, and a lot of championship teams, a lot of football league teams do this, they will take the local radio commentary and put it across their own footage. And I think if you watch those, you can hear how different it is to a more normal TV commentary. There is a definite difference.
I want to go back to the anecdotes, because I always think these are quite interesting. And Paul, you and I have had 1 or 2 trips together, and you've told me all sorts of really good stories involving mainly Neil Warnock. But yeah. I love talking about getting to games and journeys. Tell us about your proposed trip on the team bus with Sheffield United when Neil Warnock was manager.
It involves another trip to Arsenal again, strangely.
Oh my gosh.
Again, another FA Cup tie, because Sheffield United seem to get Arsenal just about every season in the FA Cup. And Neil Warnock was manager at the time, and I can't remember why, but I was doing his pre-match interview at his house in Sheffield. For some reason, he couldn't hold it at the ground. And, the local newspapers were able to do their interviews over the phone. I said, well, that doesn't really work for me, Neil. I need something face to face. Well, come round to my house then. So I was like, right, okay, I'll come round to your house, no problem. Gave me the address, went over. He answers the door in his slippers. I can see it now. Wipe your feet, son. Wipe your feet, in you come. Just go through there into conservatory. Do you want a cup of tea? So yeah, I'll have a cup of tea. So sat in the conservatory and we chatted. He said, "Oh, I always listen to your program. You know that, don't you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I do know you listen to the program. And this is where I listen to it, in here, on my own, in the conservatory, looking across the garden. I always have Praise or Grumble on. You don't have to get some idiots ringing that show up, though, don't you?" And it's like, well, they're football fans. They've all got their opinions. Anyway, did the interview ahead of the Arsenal game. And at the end of it, when I turned the microphone off, he said, "Are you doing our game tomorrow?" I said, "I am, as it goes. Yeah, I'm coming down first thing in the morning." "Oh, don't do that, son. Come with us. 1 minute, I'll ring Donna," who was his secretary at the time and had been for years. "Donna, I've got Paul from Radio Sheffield here. Can we get him an extra room down at hotel, like, tomorrow night?" Yeah. All right. "You're coming with us, son. We're leaving on the team bus, 12:30, Bramall Lane. See you there." I'm like, wow, amazing. So really excited. I turned up at Bramall Lane about midday the following day. This was the Friday before the Saturday. The coaches there, all the kit's been loaded on. Players are arriving in the dribs and drabs, getting on the bus, and I'm kind of stood all excited next to the coach. Neil turns up, walks down the car park. "Hey up, son, you're not coming up bus. You're going with Sharon and kids." So Sharon, if you don't know, is his wife, and William and Amy. Right, okay. So I was in the car with Neil Warnock's wife driving with his two kids in the back, following the team bus to Sopwell House it was, which is a really nice hotel on the outskirts of London, which used to be the England team hotel, might still be. So yeah, I was in the car with Sharon for 3 hours or more. And let's just say she was sharing stuff with me that perhaps she shouldn't have shared. But I can't.
Oh, go on. No,
I can't divulge on this program. I did come back on the team bus, which had about 4 players on it, because I think most of them stayed in London that night. But I did get to travel on the bus on the way home. But yeah, that was near. Look, I was really grateful. I mean, still a brilliant experience to stay with the team in the hotel on the night of what for them was a huge game at the time. So I'll always be grateful.
Any other situations like that for you, Chris? Ever come close to going around someone's house to interview them, or ending up on the coach or in a car with a player?
The story that springs to mind there is that with Norwich City, they've had various quite high-profile people over the years involved off the pitch. Of course, Delia Smith being the most famous. We've had Stephen Fry on the board for a while, and Ed Balls was the Norwich City chairman for a short period of time as well. And there was one Sunday evening when I was at home, and my phone flashed up, and it was a text message from Ed Balls. And this was really unusual. I didn't even know he had my number, but I think thinking about, I had interviewed him about his role as Norwich City chairman only on a couple of occasions, but we clearly exchanged numbers at some point. And this text flashed up from Ed Balls inviting me to a hot tub party with him and Delia Smith and a few other people. And I thought, this is really strange.
Oh, hot tub party.
Yeah, I was thinking, this is really strange.
A whole different podcast.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. So I showed my wife, because I think straight away you've got to
better clear that one up.
Yeah, said, look at this has just come through from Ed Balls. And I thought, in the end, you think there's something not right here. So I left it, didn't do anything about it, and thought, I probably won't tell anyone about this, because I'm sure that wasn't meant for me. When I woke up the next morning, there was another text from Ed Balls, and it said, really sorry about the message earlier. I was recording an episode of Michael McIntyre's TV show. And you know when he does that feature where he sends a text message to everybody in Michael McIntyre's in the guest's phone? And Ed Balls was the guest that night, and he texted an invitation to a hot tub party with Delia and Ed Balls to everybody in Ed Balls' phone. And I'd got it. And then what they do on the show is they see what responses they get while Ed Balls is sat there. So thankfully, I'm so glad I didn't bite on it or respond to it.
You could have been on the show as well.
It could have been a career ender, Mike. I wouldn't be sitting here now talking to you
if you'd have got your trunks out of the chest of drawers. Exactly, you'd have been in trouble.
Yeah, so that was yes. It didn't lead to the team bus, and thankfully, it didn't lead to the hot tub with Delia and Ed Balls. But it was quite some invite, and some pictures in my mind that I can't unsee now. Definitely.
I asked John Murray and I asked Rob Daly this question in the first episode. And have you ever had to report or commentate in front of a manager. I did a post-match report in a tunnel at the Hawthorns in front of Harry Redknapp once when he was Spurs manager. Either of you have anything like that? Have to commentate in front of a player or a manager, or report in front of them?
Yeah.
Paul?
Yeah, I did a cup tie at Burton one year. Aston Villa were playing there, and they for some reason couldn't fit me in the press box at Burton, which is not the biggest anyway. So I was kind of in an overspill area doing the TV, really low down, maybe 4 rows up from the front, and there were a couple of empty seats directly to my left when the game started. One of them was then filled by a certain John Terry, who sat there for the entire game whilst I commentated on Burton against Aston Villa. Now, thankfully, it went Aston Villa's way that night and nothing for them went wrong. But that would have been, well, it was uncomfortable anyway, because I know for a fact he could hear my every word. But I'm just grateful that Burton didn't kind of do a number on Villa that night, because I might have had John Terry staring me down, but that was really unnerving to have a player of his repute literally sat 2 seats away, listening to my every word. But and the only other time, I suppose, was during COVID at Forest, where the gantry is right over the dugout there, and obviously no fans inside the ground. I think Chris Hughton was manager, and he was about to bring a player on, and I've said, player A is going off and player X is coming on, and the player who was coming on kind of turned his head and looked up gantry because he'd heard me say his name, and I'm thinking, well, if he's heard me say his name, what else have they heard? Probably every word. So yeah, that's as uncomfortable as it gets, I think, when a professional in the game is listening to your every word like that. Don't know whether Chris has ever had that, but
yeah, I have. They went through a spell. Mike will know this. The gantry at Carrow Road is the far side from where the press box is. You've been up there several times as well, Paul.
Fantastic view.
It's a great view. It's the
best views in the country, apart from Bramall Lane, which is the best.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, naturally. Yeah, it is the best view in the house, and we're so lucky to be able to commentate from there. It's our local radio position now. It's built for TV commentators, but they've let us put a line up there, and we're so lucky. But there was a spell where, particularly, it must have been a season where Norwich, as they are now, were in the Championship, where you don't get the amount of TV crews, the amount of commentators up on the gantry. So there tends to be plenty of room up there. And there was a spell where any Norwich players who were injured or wanted to bring a few friends to the game with them would be put up on the gantry. And I can remember doing one Norwich game with their, I don't know if you remember the big Swiss defender, Tim Closer, stood only about 5 or 10 yards to my left-hand side with a group of his friends. And they would have heard absolutely every word. And I can't remember which game it was or what the score was, but you do find yourself just checking everything you're saying, because you are, and it's strange because you're doing a football commentary. You hope people are listening, but it's so much more different when you can actually see those people who are listening to you. It does concentrate the mind somewhat, doesn't it?
Absolutely does.
Have you ever been berated by, I mean, we talked earlier about asking tough questions. Have you ever had a situation where a manager has berated you or had a go at you, or a player has even had a go at you post-match?
Not directly to me. A colleague of mine, Seth Bennett, was on one particular afternoon doing updates into a commentary that I was doing from Doncaster, who were, I think, playing Portsmouth at the time when Steve Cottrell was in charge, who's quite a combustible, fiery character anyway. And the game, passed without incident. I can't remember what the score was at Doncaster. Maybe Doncaster won, I don't know. But on the Monday morning, I got a phone call from Steve Cottrell's PA, who said, is that Paul Walker, sports editor at BBC Sheffield? Yeah. Steve Cottrell would like to talk to you after training. Is it okay if he gives you a call? I said, yeah, absolutely fine. And sure enough, Steve Cottrell phones and says, what was all that about on Saturday? Why did you say this about me? Why did you say that? And my team's not this. My team played like that. And you said this. And I said, whoa. I wasn't even at the game. It was an employee of mine, Seth, who was there. And I can't remember exactly what his complaint was, but he did go on quite a rant for a good 5 or 6 minutes. But by the end of it, he ended up inviting me to a game. He said, next time you're around, come and find me. We'll have a proper chat. And that was the end of it. And then he ended up at Nottingham Forest. And I can't remember why I ended up speaking to him again in the build-up to it. I ended up on a phone call with him. I don't know why. Maybe I just followed something up. And he said, if you're covering the game on Saturday, come and find me before the game. We'll have a chat. We'll have a coffee. And then we'll have a beer after. I was like, okay. Now, people watching this might not be aware that Steve Cottrell, to a lot of people, has a certain reputation within the game of being quite, as I said before, fiery and volatile. He was one of the most charming men in football I'd ever met. He stuck to his promise. I went and found him. He gave me the team in his office and who was going to play where. So that was an added bonus. That was a nice little nugget there. He gave me a cup of coffee, I think a few sandwiches along the way. Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank was in there, I remember, which was a bit strange. He didn't say much. And then after the game, he indeed invited me and Seth for a beer. And I didn't leave the City ground that night till gone 8. And
Wow.
He was just sharing football stories, telling me about him. He says people have got the wrong impression about me. When I'm out there, I do become a different person, but away from the pitch, I'm very calm, very relaxed. I just want to win. And I have to say, and very, very occasionally, he fell ill quite badly not too long ago through COVID, I remember. And I sent him a message when he was in hospital, and he came out and replied and said, look, lovely to hear from you. Hope you and the family are well. Thankfully, I'm on the mend. Yeah, what a really nice guy when you got to know him. And I just found it really interesting that he would go from, why you've said this, why have you said that about my team, to then saying, come and have a beer, let's, all water under the bridge. And, we had a really friendly chat, and he was nothing but charming.
Chris, I don't know how many managers. I mean, have you kept tabs of how many managers you've dealt with in Norwich City? But have any of them? Have you got to the point where you've actually had a really good relationship with them, to the point where you can chat off the record, have a pint of beer with, or something? Anyone?
Yeah, well, yeah, I would say a couple of things. I would say that most managers and most people in football, when you can get them in those sort of comfortable surroundings, not on air, off the record, just talking in a normal way like we are now, actually most of them you find you've got plenty in common with, because they're all football enthusiasts and they've all got some good stories to tell. It's quite often, though, the positions we're put in are with cameras and with microphones, and then the defences tend to come up because they don't want to say the wrong thing. But I had it the other way around. I had a really interesting spell where, when I first started commentating on Norwich City, the summariser who did every single game with me was a former Norwich player called Neil Adams. And we did every game together, and he was really helpful to me at the start of my commentary career, because we travelled the country together. He had actually been doing it alongside Roy for a few years before I took over. So he really did help. I can't tell you enough about how helpful he was in the first years of me doing this. When Norwich were promoted to the Premier League under Paul Lambert, Neil Adams was one of the academy coaches, and they then restructured things and had enough money to employ him full time. So he had a decision to make then. Did he want to go and be Norwich City's youth team coach, or did he want to stay on the radio? And he decided to go down the coaching route, won the FA Youth Cup a couple of years later, and before you knew it, was in charge of the first team. So suddenly, on a weekly basis, I was after every game interviewing the man that I used to travel around the country with, and that was a really strange experience, because, as we've said, we're BBC Radio Norfolk. It's my team. You always want the team to do well, but especially when it's your mate, he's the manager, and everyone knows it's your mate because they've heard you have this relationship on air over over several seasons. That was a really, really strange dynamic, and I think it probably meant that there's a bit more distance between us now, because out of respect for him, really, when he was the manager, I guess I could have called him quite often and could have tried to get bits of information, but I sort of chose not to, because I didn't want to put him in that position of being accused of showing favoritism or trying to get the media on side. I felt that did build a little bit of distance between us. But when I see him now, he's still involved with Norwich City now. When I see him now, it is like, it really is like seeing an old friend. So I always look forward to catching up with him. But it was it was one of those experiences that when we were traveling together watching Norwich week after week, I didn't really think that one day he would become the Norwich City manager, but for the best part of a year he was.
Sean asks, Chris, when covering the club you support, how do you keep your cool in the big moments, the last-minute winners, when you're on air? And off air, are you doing this like a lot of us do?
I think sometimes you probably are, yeah. But I think, I don't know, it'd be interesting what Paul thinks about this. I think most commentators have a moment, probably quite early on in their careers, where they go over the top, where they lose it too much, and you've had a last-minute winner, and you've gone with the moment, but you've perhaps gone a little bit too much with the moment. And again, it comes down to that word balance, because of course, if the team that you're there commentating on, actually in any game, if there's a last-minute winner, it's fantastically exciting. You've got to rise to the occasion. Paul talked about battling the crowd noise, rising above that earlier on. You've got to do that, but you can't do it to an extent that people listening in the car or in the kitchen don't know what's happening anymore. And sometimes if you're just shouting, that's what you are. You become a man standing next to a field shouting if you're not careful. And that's no help to anyone listening at home trying to work out who scored, how it's gone in. So again, I think the more you do it, the more experienced you become. You develop this setting somewhere between 10 and 11, where you are conveying the excitement, but you're holding something back that means you can still describe what's happened. And I think that's something that I hope I've got better at over the years. But again, you're only, as a commentator, you're only as good as the material in front of you, aren't you? If you're not getting last-minute winners season after season, as for the last couple of years, we haven't really had that often with Norwich until more recently, things have got better. Then you find yourself not having to deliver those occasions too often. But yeah, at the moment, it's going a bit better again. So I think you have to find that right balance between, yes, getting the mood right, yes, conveying the excitement, but not shouting yourself hoarse so that people can't understand what's happened.
You've also got to pitch your commentary, haven't you, Paul? When you start a commentary, when you're doing it, your standard commentating, you can't be up here because you've got nowhere else to go.
That's true, but I did lose it once. Sheffield United against Leeds in the League Cup 2003, Bramall Lane. Neil Warnock was manager, and they went on these fantastic cup runs in both the FA Cup and the League Cup. And Phil Jagielka equalised for Sheffield United against Leeds at Bramall Lane. Any Blades fans watching will know immediately the goal I'm talking about. He's possibly 35, 40 yards out. It's an absolute bullet that flew in past Paul Robinson, I think it was. And I totally lost it. I said unbelievable in the commentary clip maybe 5 or 6 times. My voice went, and I just said, my voice has gone, I don't care, blah, 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 blah. To this day, it haunts me. Sheffield United fans seem to love it. I get reminded of it all the time. Genuinely, I hate hearing it back. And you can hear it back in the Football Museum in Preston. There are various examples of football commentary in the Football Museum in Preston, of which I've got 3 or 4 examples in there, one of which is that one. But I wouldn't say it made me famous, but it certainly elevated me to a different level here in Sheffield. And occasionally people remind me of it. Some fans I know have got it as their ringtone, even now. But I can't stand it. I wouldn't, if I was to do that game again, I would not do it at all like that.
It's interesting because the fans love that excitement, but from a professional level, like Chris has said, we have to be able to control it.
Yeah, I didn't in that moment. I'll admit I didn't. I just went off the scale with it, and it was only the equaliser because Peter Unlove then scored in added on time. We thought the Jagielka goal was going to take it to extra time. Then Peter Unlove scored in stoppage time and won the game for Sheffield United. And again, because I'd gone so strong with the Jagielka goal, I felt I had to do it again with the Peter Unlove goal. Not so much. People don't remind me about the Peter Unlove goal. It's only the Jagielka goal. And if you really want to find out what I'm talking about, you can YouTube it. It's out there somewhere. But just don't send me any comments about it, please.
Yeah, I had a similar one.
It's deeply embarrassing.
Yeah, I feel this is, again, it's so cathartic because I had a similar one when Norwich City were going for promotion, back-to-back promotions from League One to the Premier League under Paul Lambert. And on Easter Monday, I think there were 2 games to go after it, something like that, or 3 games to go. And they were drawing 2-2 with Derby. It was deep into stoppage time. They were 3rd in the table as it stood. they had won a corner, and if they scored from that corner, they were going back into the automatic promotion positions with 2 or 3 games to go. And from that corner, there was a bit of a scramble, and Simeon Jackson completed his hat-trick. And Carrow Road went crazy. I did too. And it's a piece of commentary that I've been reminded about a lot since, but I wouldn't care if I never heard it again, because it's, as a piece of radio football commentary, it's not very good. But I'm just glad it was slightly before things went viral on social media. Social media hadn't really taken off at that point, so I'm very, very glad.
Do you, over the course of your career, and I don't know whether you did this in the early part of your career, do you analyze what you've done and listen back to get better? Was it something you did when you had the chance?
Yeah, I still do to some extent. I don't sit and listen to every, because I find it quite uncomfortable listening to myself on the radio. I find it quite useful listening to other people, not to borrow their style, but to completely copy somebody else. I don't think you can ever do that, because that's a sure route to failure. But I think just hearing little turns of phrase, little nuances, the way that people bring summarizers in, or the way that people will link to latest scores from other games, little tricks. I think you can always learn from listening to others. I think it is important to listen back to yourself from time to time, and maybe get other people, if you've got trusted friends in the business, you've got other commentators. I've been known to send some questions or some commentary clips over to others to listen to, and I found that really helpful. But I think, as Paul said earlier on, again, I think the quest for the perfect commentary is one that you'll never crack. So I think you've got to be careful. You can drive yourself crazy if you pick up on every little mistake you've made or every little thing you could have said better. I think there's probably a route for madness there as well.
Yeah, 100%. I do the same. I listen, watch other commentators in action for exactly the same reasons as Chris says. You never stop learning, do you? Doing this job, you never ever stop learning. And if you can find little turns of phrases that maybe you've not thought of before and tailor them to how you want to use them, then I think that's fair. But trying to copy somebody outright is an absolute no. You've got to stay true to yourself. You really have. You've got to have your own style.
I think this is a good way to go out now, and it's going from what you might feel are your embarrassing moments commentating to what you feel are your best moments. Or what's the best moment you've commentated on, and what's the proudest one? Sam Stone has got that question.
Oh, Chris, you go. I need some time to think about this.
I think the one that I always think of, there's one goal that I've ever commentated on that I have, as it was happening, I have genuinely got a proper head rush from, and that was when Norwich went 2-0 up at Wembley in the playoff final against Middlesbrough in 2015. They started that game brilliantly under Paul's old friend Alex Neil, before Paul had to ask him all those nasty questions about whether he was fearing for his job or not. They went 1-0 up quite early through Cameron Jerome, and then only shortly after that, the ball broke to Nathan Redmond in the penalty area, quite near where we were. We were the right end of the ground to see the goal, right behind it when he hit it, and you knew it was going in. And as that ball hit the back of the net, 2-0 up in the playoff final, I had this feeling, this head rush that I've never experienced before or since from any goal, where you think, hang on, my team, the team that I'm commentating on, this is going so well. We're 2-0 up at Wembley. And that was one where I was able to, unlike in the previous examples we've been talking about, I was actually able to get hold of it a bit and ride it, and I think do it justice. And there was another one that Norwich had a few seasons later where they were going for promotion later in the season, and Mario Vrancic curled in a free kick to get a 2-2 draw against Sheffield Wednesday, a vital point right at the end of the season. And that's one that I feel better about listening to, because that one I feel I did justice to. But the Wembley goal, Nathan Redmond's Wembley goal, I've never felt emotionally like it for any other goal before or since.
Yeah.
Does yours involve Arsenal, Paul?
No, you might be surprised. It's a really interesting question, that, because I could pick so many. A lot of them involve Sheffield United, not just because I'm a Blade, but because of the season I'm thinking about. It's still to this day one of the most exciting seasons I've ever covered. That 2003 season, which oddly, they didn't win anything. They got to 2 FA Cup semi-finals. They got to the playoff final, and they lost every single game. There was, I suppose, one of the big moments, and it's not a goal. It's the David Seaman save from Paul Pescasolido at Old Trafford, which is just I don't think we'll ever see the like of that again. It was just an incredible save. Everybody in that stadium thought he was in, and Seaman somehow managed to claw it out. So that was a big moment for me, because obviously that's been replayed countless times since. Not necessarily my commentary, because it was a live TV game at the time. Sheffield Wednesday in the playoff final at the Millennium Stadium under Paul Sturrock was great, and I had a real connection with that particular group of players at the time. What a band of brothers they were. Lee Bullen, John Paul McGovern, Lee Peacock, Drew Talbot, Steve McLean. And I wanted them to win so badly. One, because I wanted them out of League One, but they'd been in such a state before then. And Paul Sturrock was such a wonderful man to deal with. I was absolutely thrilled that they were able to win on that particular occasion against Hartlepool. I was just trying to think of some TV games that I've done, and playoff finals, League Cup finals. Just, I suppose when you're doing what I'm doing now, where you don't have a particular attachment to teams, it's harder to recall goals that you're really proud of. I think any goal that you do and you call right and you don't stuff it up is always a good goal in my view, because as commentators, as much as it is about the 90 minutes, the key moments are the goals. You want to get the goals right. You don't want to get a goal scorer wrong, do you? Let's be honest, because those are the bits that are going to be replayed over and over and over. And we all do it. I had one the other week at Coventry where I was convinced Josh Bowler had scored for Cardiff, where he spun in the 6-yard box. And what you don't see is Liam Kitching, who's literally got his foot planted right next to Josh Bowler's, who puts it in his own net. We get TV replays. You can clear it up on the replay. So, yeah, I would say that. I think, as of now, you want to call those big moments correctly. You don't want to get it wrong. And I think any other commentator, certainly doing TV and radio as well, would say the same.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so addictive, Mike. I think why we're all here and why a lot of people.
That's
do
the ultimate. It's the ultimate aim, isn't it?
Yeah, you never quite feel you've got everything 100% right, and I think that's what keeps us all coming back. And there's so many familiar faces we see around the country who have been doing this for a long, long time, and none of them will ever feel like they've completely cracked it. And I think that's what the magic is in a way. Well,
Mr. Liam Land says hasn't got a
Where's
question.
That?
Sorry?
Is that near here?
I don't know. Is that somewhere in North Derbyshire? No question, just to say he enjoyed the podcast, as I did. Thank you very much for your time, guys. And I will probably see you on the road sooner rather than later. But enjoy the rest of the season. Chris, obviously, you want Norwich City to be in the Premier League come the end of the season. What prospect of getting in the playoffs, going through the playoffs?
I think I think they've got a very good chance now of being in the playoffs. Because they're probably going to be sixth, they might nick fifth, but in all likelihood, if they do, they're going to be sixth. Whether they've quite got enough to see off whichever team it's going to be that finishes third, because I'll say Ipswich have been brilliant this season, Leeds have been brilliant this season, so have Leicester. One of those three is not going to go up automatically. So if Norwich end up against one of those teams in the playoffs, well, whoever it is, playoffs are always tense, aren't they? But that is going to be quite some occasion. What
about the Blades' hopes? I mean, they're faint hopes, but
well, we can wave to Norwich on the way down as they pass us by. Look, Sheffield United are going down, but I think they've got the right manager in place now, and recent displays I think have shown that they're finding a bit of consistency, and hopefully we'll go into the summer with renewed belief. And the beauty for Chris is he's been there before, he's done it before. He can wipe the decks clean in the summer, and hopefully Sheffield United can give it a push next year. But there's no God-given right once you've come down to go straight back up, is there? But I don't think there's a better person for the job, frankly, at the moment. If we could just finish the season strongly and give the fans something to cling on to going into the summer, that'll do for me.
Well, likewise, hopefully your seasons will finish strongly as well. Thanks very much for your time, guys. And thank you for everybody else who's been watching this evening. You've been watching the lineup on Sheepskins for Goalposts. Goodbye.
Yeah.